Two generals drove up to a modest villa on the edge of the Swabian countryside and carried with them a choice that would seal a family's fate. It was the night of October 14, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the celebrated commander of the Africa Corps turned domestic icon, had been called home after being implicated, by association, if not by direct action, in the July plot against Hitler. According to later testimony, General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel presented him with an ultimatum: submit to a public trial that would condemn not only him, but possibly his family, or take poison quietly and accept honors from the state as a loyal servant. What happened that night was not just the end of a military career. It was the moment a family decided to keep a secret that would shape its public life for decades. Rommel chose the private exit. As Lucie Rommel, his widow, would later tell Allied investigators and biographers, he swallowed cyanide and died that night. The regime moved quickly to control the story. An official communiqué claimed that Rommel had succumbed to wounds from an earlier air attack. On October 18, 1944, the Wehrmacht organized a state funeral, full military honors, public mourning, and a narrative that preserved Rommel as a decorated field marshal felled in the line of duty. To the outside world, the story was straightforward. A national hero had perished. Inside the villa, Lucie and her teenage son Manfred carried a different knowledge and a difficult silence. That silence mattered. For Lucie, protecting her husband's reputation and shielding her son from retribution or public disgrace were urgent, practical matters. For Manfred, then a teenager, the secrecy became formative. Observers who later chronicled the family's life emphasize how tightly they held that truth, partly out of fear under a totalitarian regime, partly from a parent's instinct to guard a child's future. The immediate moral complexity is obvious. The family elected privacy and protection over public reckoning. That decision would reverberate as Europe moved from war into occupation and then into a Cold War, in which old enemies and new alliances reshaped how history was told. When Allied forces reached the Rommel Villa in late April 1945, the private truth entered official record. On April 27, 1945, Captain Charles F. Marshall of the British Army interviewed Lucie at Herrlingen. His notes, later cited by historians, record her account of the ultimatum and of Rommel's death. This interception was the first clear Allied documentation that contradicted the German state's wartime narrative. The interview mattered less for immediate political consequences. By then the Third Reich was collapsing. But it mattered enormously for how Rommel's death would be recounted to posterity. Lucie's testimony supplied the primary basis for many post-war biographies and for the cautious, often contradictory public understanding of Rommel's final days. In the shadow of defeat, Lucie remained at the villa. The immediate aftermath of the war was austere: a modest pension, a household reduced from its wartime position, and the heavy weight of keeping a scandalous truth from becoming fodder for vengeance or spectacle. Yet Lucie did not retreat entirely from the emerging post-war culture of remembrance. Over the following decades, she chose cooperation with biographers. Desmond Young and B.H. Littlehart, among others, sought access to family papers and personal recollections as they shaped early narratives about Rommel. Lucie's willingness to talk, carefully, selectively, helped establish an image that some later critics would call sanitized. A brilliant soldier who had been politically marginal and ultimately opposed to the regime. It was a portrayal useful to a divided and uneasy Europe trying to rebuild German military credibility in the face of Soviet expansion. In 1962, Lucie acted as a consultant for a feature film project about the war years, a public role that further steered the family narrative into the realm of cinematic myth. She died in 1971, still the keeper of certain private papers and memories. Her choices, what to disclose and what to protect, left an archive that scholars and filmmakers would mine for decades. At times, Lucie cooperated out of a belief that a truthful, measured account would serve the family and history. At other times, she seemed to maneuver to preserve dignity and to avoid a public trial over moral and political culpability that might damage her son's prospects. Manfred Rommel's post-war life shows how a family name can be remade by pragmatic civic engagement. He was a wartime youth who saw combat as a young soldier, but after 1945 he pursued education and a career in public administration. Over the course of his life he became a significant political figure in West Germany, emerging as a proponent of integration and reconciliation rather than nationalist triumphalism. Manfred entered the post-war civil service and later entered politics with the Christian Democratic Union, CDU. By the late 20th century, he had become one of Stuttgart's most recognizable public servants, serving for decades as the city's mayor. In that role, he cultivated a reputation for good-humored pragmatism, for championing the city's cultural life, and for insisting on humane policies toward vulnerable groups. A few episodes illustrate his approach and the symbolic power of the Rommel name when steered in a reconciliatory direction. As mayor, Manfred insisted on dignified burials for wartime prisoners and took stands that sometimes drew criticism from more conservative constituencies. He cultivated friendships across former wartime divides, meeting with and hosting the sons of Allied commanders, and he became a visible symbol of a Germany willing to engage rather than withdraw. Honors flowed from both domestic and international quarters. Among the awards reported in contemporary accounts were the Bundesverdienstkreuz, Germany's Order of Merit, and foreign recognitions such as honorary degrees and distinctions from Allied countries. He remained in public memory a figure who consciously repurposed a difficult family legacy into civic service. Manfred Rommel died in 2013, leaving behind a long public career that many saw as a mode of atonement, or at least of forward-looking reconstruction. Behind these public arcs lay quieter and more complicated family stories. Long before Lucie and Erwin married, Rommel had a relationship with a woman named Walburga Stemmer. From that liaison came a daughter, Gertrude, who was raised initially as if she were someone else's child, a social arrangement common in a time and culture that could be harsh toward unmarried mothers and their offspring. The family's treatment of Gertrude reflected social constraints and personal choices. For years, Gertrude lived at some remove from the official Rommel household. Only later would letters and private papers surface that revealed the emotional contours of that relationship. The circumstances of Walburga Stemmer's death are sensitive and, in parts, unclear. Some accounts suggest illness, others hint at suicide. The sources are not definitive, and historians caution against speculation. What the documentary record does show is that Gertrude, her daughter, remained a discreet but persistent presence in family memory. After the war, Gertrude's own children and descendants began to release letters and personal items that gave researchers a more intimate glimpse into Rommel's private life. Notes that complicated the tidy public image cultivated by post-war biographies. Gertrude herself died in 2000. The papers that surfaced later helped historians appreciate that Rommel's personal world was more tangled than the heroic portrait presented at his state funeral. If the Rommel household chose confidentiality in 1944, others chose to amplify or reshape Rommel's image in the colder political climate of the 1950s and 1960s. One of the crucial figures in that process was General Hans Speidel, a wartime officer who, like many former Wehrmacht leaders, found a new role in West Germany's rearmament and in NATO's Cold War alignment. Speidel and his circle promoted a narrative of Rommel that emphasized tactical brilliance, professional soldiering, and a purported distance from Nazi ideology. This framing was politically useful to Western allies who wanted to rebuild German armed forces capable of countering the Soviet threat. It was also useful to West German politicians seeking to rehabilitate military tradition without the taint of Nazism. Biographers and publicists did the rest. Desmond Young's early biography and compilations, such as the Rommel Papers, often presented with editorial interventions by figures like Liddell Hart, established a Rommel renaissance. These works tended to highlight Rommel's battlefield acumen, his respect for soldiers on both sides, and, in certain readings, his supposed opposition to Nazi extremism. The myth was both international and transactional. Allied audiences could accept a German soldier rendered as an honorable foe, and West German policymakers could point to a figure who aided the normalization of rearmament and integration into Western defense structures. But myth is never unchallenged. From the late 20th century onward, historians began to scrutinize Rommel's record more critically. Scholars such as Alaric Searle and Peter Lieb, among others, have interrogated the idea that Rommel was a clear opponent of Nazi policy, or that his relationship to the regime was unambiguously adversarial. These historians point to Rommel's early career, his willingness to serve Hitler's military aims, and the limits of his involvement, or lack thereof, in the July 20th plot. Rather than seeing a binary of collaborator versus resistor, contemporary scholarship tends to place Rommel within a spectrum of accommodation, professional opportunism, and occasional dissent. The balance of evidence suggests a complex figure whose wartime actions and posthumous reputation were shaped as much by geopolitical needs as by moral clarity. That contest over meaning is precisely where the Rommel family's choices matter. Lucie's selective disclosures, Manfred's civic rehabilitation of the name, and the later circulation of personal papers by Gertrude's branch of the family all fed into competing narratives. A family that kept a wartime secret, yet later cooperated with biographers, helped create an image that could be sharpened, softened, or revised depending on political winds. Through their actions, silence, cooperation, and public service, Lucie and Manfred transformed a private tragedy into a public asset that served reconciliation and Cold War diplomacy, even as it raised unresolved questions about accountability and collective memory. So, what really happened to Rommel's family after WWII? They navigated a precarious path between protection and publicity. Immediately after his death, they guarded the truth to preserve dignity and safety. In the occupation years, Lucie's testimony to Allied officers recorded the private version of events, which later became a touchstone for historians. Over subsequent decades, Lucie collaborated selectively with biographers and film producers, shaping a narrative that emphasized honor and distance from Nazism. Gertrude's later release of letters added nuance and revealed personal ties that complicate any single story. Manfred built a public life centered on municipal leadership and reconciliation, turning the family name into a civic instrument rather than a militaristic banner. Historiography and memory kept shifting around them. For some, Rommel remained a tactician and a tragic figure. For others, his career illustrated the moral hazard of professional soldiers operating within a criminal regime. The family's trajectory, from private silence to public cooperation and civic engagement, helped make Rommel a figure useful to both Western policymakers and to a West German society seeking respectable continuity with its past. At the same time, later scholarship has steadily insisted on a more critical view, reminding us that the post-war Renaissance was partly manufactured and partly the product of real human choices aimed at survival and reinvention. There is no single neat verdict. The Rommels were neither wholly victims nor unambiguous exculpators of a problematic legacy. They were survivors who shaped, deliberately and unintentionally, how the world would remember Erwin Rommel. Their lives after 1945, Lucie's guarded cooperation and death in 1971, Gertrude's quieter line and the posthumous release of family letters, and Manfred's long career as a mayor until his death in 2013, show how a family navigated the moral and political turbulence of post-war Europe. In a broader sense, their story illustrates a common post-war pattern. Private choices about truth and memory can have outsized public consequences when political actors, biographers, and nations seek symbols to justify new alignments. If this account raises questions you'd like to explore further about the Rommel papers, the role of Hans Speidel, or the later historiographical debates, there are detailed biographies and archival collections that trace these threads with fuller citation. And if you want another family follow-up from WWII, an examination of what happened to another household shaped by conflict, check the related video on this channel that explores the aftermath for a different wartime family. For now, the short answer to the title question: Rommel's family survived by balancing secrecy and selective disclosure. They managed their private grief while shaping a public legacy that served reconciliation and, for better or worse, reshaped how Europe remembered one of its most famous commanders. If you found this journey through memory and consequence useful, subscribe for more deep dives into the human stories behind historical headlines and watch our playlist on WWII Legacies to keep exploring.